Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. He's an economist, he's an author, he's been part of government planning and strategy. Of course, he's also a banker and a columnist. Dr. Shankar Acharya has recently released his book, a personal memoir of sorts. And he joins me now to talk not just about the track that he has seen economically, but what he saw in terms of governments, in terms of finance ministers, and of course, his own personal memories all weaved into that. Thank you, Dr. Acharya, for joining in and speaking with me today, and congratulations on this book of yours. I think you've explained a little bit of why. Yes, we should have a match the shot. I think you've explained a little bit of why you chose to read it, but to write it, I beg your pardon. But as I was reading it, I was wondering, why now? A personal memoir is almost like a circle in the sand that is completed. Why did you choose to write this piece at this point in time?
Well, as I've sort of hinted in or written in the book, Mitali, I think the proximate trigger was lockdown last year.
Yeah.
At which, the formal lockdown was limited, but for those of us in our mid-70s, we were advised to stay under house arrest. And that kind of, changed one's life. I was used to going to an office, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's only so much Netflix and Amazon you can watch. And since people had been telling me for quite a while, but I had successfully ignored it up till then, that, why don't I try my hand at a memoir? Just like that. And so this sort of came together. The lockdown, as I say, was the proximate trigger. And instead of sitting on a sofa watching the television screen, I moved to my computer and started writing. And actually, what I found was that, there's always the initial hesitation to start in any writing, as you probably know yourself. But, once I started chronologically, going back in time to, well, I can't say zero, but what I could remember from 2.5 years old. The sort of act of remembering became interesting to me and pleasurable. And then writing it up, whatever I remembered, in a coherent fashion, hopefully. And then sharing with, close relatives, obviously one's family, and close friends, maybe a dozen people. And that, as chapters evolved, proved to be both an act of social sharing, if you like, with those one is emotionally close to, as well as enormous encouragement and feedback from nearly all of them. And that kept my discipline going in terms of sitting every day 3-4 hours and so on. Aside from that, of course, I'm pushing 76, and if I'm ever going to write my memoirs, better not wait.
76 is the new 50, the new 50 is the new 30. It's all recalibrating, sir. So much of what you've written is so rich in economic history and experience, but I wanted to ask a non-economy related question before we delve into that, which is that when I was reading through the parts of your childhood memories and your childhood experiences, it's a charmed life of many travels and many sights. As someone who's seen the India of then and as someone who's living through the India of now, do you sense a shift? Do you recognize this as the same cosmopolitan, bustling space that it seemed to be, ironically, many years back?
No, I'm not sure. Many years back, when I was let's take Delhi, so we can compare like to like. My kind of last childhood contact with Delhi of any consequence was between the ages of, I guess, 10 and 13. When I went to St. Columba School, my father was in the Foreign Service, Joint Secretary in MEA, and so on. And we lived on what is now called Motilal Nehru Road, then was called York Road, and had a nice bungalow and all that. And that was not a bustling cosmopolitan place by the standards of today at all. it was a much smaller city in population, much smaller. I don't know the numbers offhand, but if you take Greater Delhi today, it's 20 million or thereabouts. I would be surprised if that was much more than 1 million at that time. So we were talking about a much, when we went on family picnics, we regarded going to the Qutub and house cars as somewhere outside.
Yeah. No, I actually didn't mean in terms of numbers. I meant in terms of perhaps mindsets.
I mean, one is a schoolboy. So, and a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever. So life is buzzing because you have to go to school, do your schoolwork, go out to play, that sort of thing. So it's different. I mean, the key difference, I would say, in that respect, is there were no electronic devices. None. Even the phone didn't always work. And certainly you couldn't just sit there and chat forever, holding those enormous black phones. So, your non-sleeping, non-working, non-school life, you had to create out of your friends, out of your family, and so on, and books.
Let me jump forward then to your college years, where you have also talked about your experiences at Harvard, where you met Amartya Sen. You have mentioned many others from the world of economics. Who would you say, sir, has left the most impressionable mark on you as a then young economist? And, that's something you carried through the years.
Well, first of all, for those who are not familiar with the book, I should mention that, after the age of 13, I was abroad because, again, family life. And I went to school in England, which was an extraordinary experience for me because I was the only Indian in a boarding school or a school of 600 English boys. That has its own challenges, but that's not what you're asking about. And then I went to Oxford for my undergraduate, which was very different and charming and so on. But in a sense, I should not separate out Oxford and Harvard. They were part of university education. And I don't know that anybody in Oxford in particular, amongst my tutors and lecturers, left indelible imprint on what I learned as an economist. For one thing, I was doing this mixed up course called PPE, Politics, Philosophy and Economics. My college tutor was a very nice person and taught as a tutor nicely, but a lot of the lectures I went to were given by very famous people, but they weren't necessarily great lecturers, as I've observed in my book. People like Sir John Hicks, Sir Roy Harrod, won Nobel Prizes and things later on, but they were not great lecturers. And in fact, I think that the lecturer from Oxford that resides in my mind was a political scientist, Sir Isaiah Berlin, who lectured on political theory. So I would say that my economics was really picked up from other students, and tutorials I went to had for a particular macroeconomics kind of paper, I had a particular good tutor in Christchurch College, who I went to from my own college, Peter Oppenheimer. But I would not say that this was a formative thing. Then when I went on to Harvard, which is, by the way, quite a cold shower after you're an undergraduate at Oxford, because that's much more, you're here to be a serious professional in this field. You do the coursework, get through it, then you write your dissertation, and you buckle down. Yeah. And there I had some interesting teachers, some not so interesting teachers, but all famous people. And once again, I'm at a bit of a loss to say that there was one guiding spirit in my economics. I think it was a sort of smorgasbord of so much choice. And even the courses you didn't take, you could go and audit them. I mean, I remember particular outstanding lecturers like Martin Feldstein, whose name you may have heard of, who taught me macroeconomics. I remember someone called Howard Reifer in the Harvard Business School, who taught wonderfully. statistical theory and so forth. So those particular things I remember, but I'm not sure that they form my economics. I certainly remember Subramaniam Swamy, who was already a young assistant professor and a very good teacher, I have to say. I remember Amartya Sen, who came visiting one year as a young professor and so on. So it was a combination, though, I would have to say. I wouldn't say I had a one guru.
I'm going to keep moving back and forth and not in the clear sequential line that you have drawn. I want to fast forward to the years when you came back to India, and not just came back to India, but were part of policy making and part of the government. I'm reading an excerpt where you talk about a note that you came out on the aspects of the Black economy in India. And you say quite clearly that the report went into the causes and consequences of Black income generation, but it was also skeptical about the efficacy of demonetization and voluntary disclosure schemes. Given the fact that you had the opportunity to study this at such length, so what did you make of the decision when it was announced? And did you have a sense of foreboding about where it could go?
When it was announced in 2016 November.
That's right, yes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had a lot of foreboding. I understood in some sense where it was coming from, because of course, the Black economy, Black money, corruption, etc., is quite, unfortunately, deep-seated and deep-rooted in our society and economy. So, political executive wanting to tackle that was, I think, an entirely admirable motivation. But partly because I remembered a little bit of what I had studied and written about 30 plus years ago in the 1980s. And very soon, as you know, we saw this phenomenon of, as a consequence of those decisions, and money drying up, cash drying up, and hearing stories of those who do all their economic activity in cash, not necessarily illegally, by the way. It's just that small, players in the economy do it that way. It's more convenient in many ways. It really was. I mean, I was very worried that it would hit the informal sector, which about 80+% of our labor force is in the informal sector, perhaps 85%. It would hit them very hard economically. Even though it was a temporary blow, it was temporary for a few months. And so I was concerned about that.
Not taking into account the impact that COVID has had in the last year and a half, though, Dr. Acharya, would you say that was sort of a pivotal moment for the Indian economy? It may have been temporary in terms of the nature of the action, but do you think its damage has been far more long-lasting?
I think that's very possibly true, Mitali. I think that, I mean, actually, if you even look at the macro data, what you see is after the dip in things like GDP growth in the last 2 or 3 years of the UPA government, significant dip. That was the years of policy paralysis and scams and whatnot. You do see a pickup in after the new government comes, NDA. You do see a pickup in 2014-15 and 15-16, in terms of the aggregate GDP numbers and so forth, and a general sense of economic activity, more confidence in investing and so on and so forth. But I think that was a bit of a watershed, demonetization, because it shook people, I think, not just those who were immediately impacted, but also who felt that, coming out of the blue, and one soon heard rumors that neither the RBI nor the Finance Ministry was, so to speak, originators of the idea, if you see what I mean. There was a worry that, it was a sort of leap in the dark kind of thing. And that, of course, makes all investors concerned. So that was one. The other is that, remember, it's once again, this is one of those things which badly hit the informal sector, very badly, because you had, um, well, I've already gone through that, so let me not repeat. But the other thing that happened in fairly quick succession is the transition to the GST,
Yeah.
which was a major reform. And I've been in favor of it, so I don't back away from that. But the particular way that the GST occurred, in terms of its complexity of rates and its complexity of administration and so on, initially especially, I think again hit the same informal sector, small shopkeepers, small this, small that, very hard. So those who were just beginning to recover from the shock of demonetization were sort of, once again shaken up and hurt badly. So I think because that, if you recall, happened in July 2017, and this had happened, the demonetization in November 2016. So taken together, I think that really shook up for a quite long period, and I'm not sure we fully recovered. Of course, after that we've had COVID and so on. From the informal sector, particularly, has not, I think, recovered. And in a way, just how badly it was hurt by those two shocks and COVID, lockdown, and all that came later. I personally am a little bit skeptical about the quality of the data that we have, because we don't have much direct data.
You also, in your years with Mr. VP Singh as finance minister, allude to a reform measure that was being carried out in terms of stricter income tax declarations. But you write with some amount of candor that this was not met very well. It meant closer scrutiny of the accounts of big companies, as you write. And then you say that trouble started brewing. And very soon, Mr. VP Singh was shifted. The pips began to squeak to the PMO, and he moved from finance to defense. Has this been a running experience for you, Dr. Acharya, having worked with the government? The fact that there is very often a clash between policy and politics, and most often it is policy that must bend.
Well, let me say a few words about that particular example.
Yeah.
First of all, as I've written, I think VP Singh was an excellent finance minister and a tax reforming one. All this long-term fiscal policy and all which came. But you're not referring to that. You're talking about what his first budget, which I had not, and I wasn't in the ministry. The first budget occurred in February of '85. I'd literally just joined. And as an economic advisor, you're not in the budget group, which is more senior kind of setup. But in his first budget, he reduced those. He cut income tax rates, direct income tax rates, quite a bit. But he also made it very clear that, look, I expect better compliance. And in fact, the revenue returns of that year, as I recall them, because I had to write the economic surveys and so on, so I knew the numbers, at the end of the year, fiscal year, 85, 86, were very good. So, even though tax rates have been cut, actual revenues from those taxation was quite high. But then you see, when you get into also kind of tightening up on the corporate side of direct taxation, which happened pretty much simultaneously, there, and this may be true of all high net worth individuals, if you had a history of unreasonably high tax rates, a lot of people, whether companies or rich individuals, find ways of avoiding those high tax rates. Avoidance can be legal, evasion is not. That's the normal distinction that we make, as you know. But that's a line blurred by the individual. And so, and particularly in the case of companies, at least some of them, and also high net worth individuals, some of them, they were used to keeping some of their assets, in, say, overseas territories and things like that. So VP Singh, I think, felt that, he had to be consistent with what he said he would do. And he staffed up in a way, he had a strong revenue secretary in the form of Mr. Vinod Pandey, who later became cabinet secretary when VP Singh became prime minister. And couple of other people I mentioned in the book who were sort of given the task of getting tough on compliance. And compliance inevitably meant that people were going to get upset. And I think the story goes, I cannot validate this in any proof sense, that a lot of them complained to the PMO, that is Rajiv Gandhi's PMO. And that's how pressures to shift VP Singh came about. And I think the tragedy of this, how it played, is not that these things happen to people, but that I think, and shortly thereafter, the before stuff came out in the spring of 1987, and Mr. VP Singh resigned from defense and went into essentially opposition. The tragedy, I think, is with that break between Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh, the most important and, if you like, reformist axis in that cabinet and government got snapped. So the years that followed, the remainder of Rajiv Gandhi's term, as far as economic policy was concerned, was substantially less lackluster.
You have had the opportunity, though, to observe in action finance ministers VP Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh, of course, Mr. Yashwant Sinha as well. From the point of view of doing what is absolutely appropriate for the nation policy-wise, who would you accord the highest marks to, for lack of a better term?
Well, I mean, marks is too many, too precise. But I think I've said this. Well, I certainly accord Mr. VP Singh, in the 2 years that he spent in the finance ministry in the mid-80s, very high marks. I'm not going to put it in a comparative framework, but he was certainly better. No, I can't put it in. He was certainly a better finance minister than, say, the two that came after him, Mr. N.D. Tiwari and Mr. S.B. Chawhan. I mean, they were much more old school Congress senior politicians. And whereas Mr. VP Singh, the Congress, came from a different, sort of more modernist outlook, even though he was a Raja of sorts and had a slightly feudal background. But I think he was very good. I mean, later in the 90s, when I worked with three gentlemen you mentioned, and again, I've written about this, I would say that, first of all, the most important point I think to recognize is that Manmohan Singh, P. Chidambaram, Yashwant Sinha, all three were outstanding. And three of the best finance ministers I've had the pleasure of having any kind of contact with. There may have been others afterwards. I doubt that they were better, but I don't personally know. But those three were very good. So they were really very good. And in terms of my ease of working with them and so on, I would say certainly Manmohan Singh, being an economist also perhaps, I had slightly known him, because he used to come to Washington as part of the finance ministry delegation when I was a youngster working in the World Bank, and used to want to meet us youngsters and all that. So I had higher degrees of comfort level in terms of working with, I was at a senior level then, chief economic advisor. When I think with Mr. Chidambaram, who came later with the United Front government, it was, in some ways, he was new to me, but he was a very sharp, very able lawyer, as you know, very quick in picking up the brief, as you might say, and he could often be very charming, and but I think I've made some remark about occasionally he was a bit arrogant and all that, and people have blown it out of context. I think that's not correct, but I think he held together, and I mean the important point is that the UF government was a fairly motley collection of parties. And as finance minister, I think Mr. Chidambaram played an admirable role in ensuring that the reforms that had been done in the previous 5 years of the Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh ministry were not reversed. There may not have been all that much forward movement, but just holding the sort of line I think was very important. Yashwant Sinha, when he came, was a total unknown to me. I think right somewhere I had initially some trepidation because, politician from Bihar and worries about, he worked in the Chandrasekhar government for a few months. But he turned out to be wonderfully, he was easy to get along, very courteous, very pleasant. And what's more, he was also genuinely very, very reformist. And Mr. Bajpai gave him the leeway to follow through, along with other ministers. And I think the Bajpai government, as you know, I give high praise to. So that's a slightly rambling answer.
Let me ask you this then, Dr. Acharya, and you write, and I quote, this is also something that you wrote in the Business Standard, where you say, fundamentally, the decade of the UPA government has failed to undertake economic, social, and administrative reform to strengthen India's long-term development potential. It is hard to resist the conclusion that the overall economic legacy is bad, if not ugly. Given those very sharp and scathing words, how would you describe, sir, the period that we are living through now, and what would you put it down to?
I hesitate to say much about the current period because it's still evolving, for one thing. I have been totally out of government during this period, and even the people I know are not in government much.
Is it evolving, sir? I mean, we've had, 11 to 13 quarters now of downward trending growth.
Sure. I have written about that too. I mean, my right. I mean, I think some of my writings. But I think I would say that it's a mixed record. I mean, I think the period of the UPA government, 10 years, going back for a moment, if I may, and to that particular quote that you have given me, was really commenting on what was the sort of state of the system being left to the new government? And I felt it was not a good one, pretty bad. I think the title of that article was "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly," and that hence the term "ugly" comes out. The record of economic performance in the first 7 or 8 years of those decades was very good because it was essentially building on the reforms of the 90s, that is of the Rao government, and very importantly of the Bajpai government for 6 years. Together, I think they laid a foundation basis on which that super high growth occurred between essentially 2003 to 2010-11, and then it dropped off. And the problem is that while performance was good, and precisely because economic performance depends not on necessarily contemporary policies, but what was done earlier, cumulatively, that the fact that there was very little productivity enhancing reforms taking place during that UPA decade meant that you may not see that kind of burst repeated. I mean, there are a lot of other factors too, external ones, internal ones, and so on. Externally, initially, the UPA government period, 5-6 years up to global financial crisis, was strongly helped by the world economy. But I think that the overall, it was when the Modi government came in, they didn't inherit a great economy at all, and they had challenges. And Modi Jaitley, I should mention, since Mr. Arun Jaitley was minister. And as I mentioned, they were doing reasonably well in the first 2-3 years before they ran into the kinds of demonetization, problems with the GST. But the fact that they got the GST done was very creditable because previous governments had been successful in getting GST through. So I think the record of reforms during this government, which is now 7 years old, has been more mixed. We've seen good things like one I mentioned, and on GST as well as the IBC, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. We've seen the more recent attempts at reforming agricultural marketing, labor codes, and of course the most recent budget's move towards a more private sector economy, including, for example, denationalization or privatization of some banks. These big reforms, though, a lot of them I would regard as work in progress. They're hard to do, and we don't quite know whether they've taken hold and taken root. So I'm not sanguine about the future.
Okay, fair enough. Let me come to the here and now on two counts. One is the future of the banking and finance industry, and the other is growth. We'll take them separately. On banking, you've had a salutary contribution to the growth of Kotak Mahindra Bank and where it is today. But given the economic situation at this point, Dr. Acharya, that seems to be the one cylinder that is not firing. What do you make of where the banking industry has gotten itself into, and what do you think it would take to break it out of this funk?
My thought on banking is, you have to separate out the system as a whole, the banking sector, versus individual banks. And particularly where you have a class of banks like the PSBs, the public sector banks, which sort of have a separate regulatory system. They don't quite fall under the ones that apply to the private sector banks. And they're in a sense, more protected by the regulator, if you like, regulator come government, I should say, from, if they do things wrong and so on. And in another sense, the incentives allow them to be less efficient in their commercially. They can always blame it on, well, the government asks us to do other things as well, not just pure banking. We are sort of an arm of the finance ministry to do X, Y, Z. And that also has truth in it. But what that means is that, if you like, the lack of commercial profitability of the public sector banks allows the private sector banks to look very good. And some of them are very good, some not so good. But the point I was trying to get at is individual banks, particularly individual private sector banks, like the one I had the privilege of being associated with for 15 years, 12 as chair, can, if they sort of do the right things commercially, according to regulations, according to laws, everything else, can, and execute very well, can for a long period, with the right kind of leadership, get great results, which Kotak has done and has continues to do. And I would say HDFC Bank, which is a bigger bank, falls in that category too, but I don't know it that well because I'm an outsider to them. But when you take the system as a whole, which is dominated in size terms by the PSU banks, then there are all sorts of problems in performance. You also have to recognize that banking itself can't do wonderfully if the economy is not doing wonderfully. I mean, ultimately, you need the demand for either investment capital or working capital coming from enterprises, which is, after all, then you have loans, which are the assets of the banking system. And if they don't have a dynamic kind of situation there, individual medium-sized banks can do okay. But for the system as a whole, it's tough.
Which brings me to growth, Dr. Acharya. You were spot on in your analysis of the kind of drop we were expecting to see, and it was that 25% drop. As we sit here and we're waiting for what the tick looks like for June, it's interesting that estimates range from 10% to 30%, for economists. What do you make of the trajectory we have going, especially in the context of, some of what you sort of hinted at, the fact that we have a consumption demand problem, we have a wage growth problem, rural India has also been hit by the second wave, we have inflation mixed into that. It's a very, very troublesome cocktail of events at this point.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the pandemic is a big, big thing. And a big, big negative thing. And the response of government in India, governments elsewhere, has been, complex. It hasn't always looked wonderful. But there doesn't seem to be a absolutely correct template, which one can say, let's just do what that government did. I mean, at least not that I'm aware of. And so that there would be a big shock became apparent to me very clear to me by May of last year, that when you are essentially doing a lockdown of almost half the economy, that means you're not producing half the economy, goods, services, you're going to have a pretty drastic decline in growth until you lift the lockdown. And that's exactly what occurred, that in the first quarter last year, we were down 25% year on year, as you remember, that, April, June quarter of 2020. Sorry, 2020, not 19. But when you loosened up, you got a recovery. And in fact, to me, the recovery, one believes the official data's quality, by the final quarter of 2021 fiscal year, it had gone back to the level of a year ago. Then came the second wave again. And as you know, overall last year we were down by 7.3% according to the official data. So obviously we were going to get a rebound this year, simply if we did less badly. And that's happening. The debate, I think, for the full year is between, even after the second wave, is essentially, as I hear it, is going to be people like me who are a little cautious, who say, well, maybe the recovery growth in FY22, that is 2022 FY, is going to be about somewhere between 7-8%. Whereas the more optimistic who say, no, it's going to be 9-10-11%. But I think it's very important to look at what's happening to the level of GDP. And the two things that come out of looking at the level, as the difference between, it's not the difference whether it's 10% or 7%, because that doesn't make that much of a difference if you look at the level. If you were at one level 2 years ago, and you then dropped by 7.5% last year, recovery of the kind we are talking about will put you back roughly to where you were, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. So what it means is for over 2 years, by the time this fiscal year we're in ends, we will have lost 2 years of so-called normal growth. Could be 10-11% cumulatively. And the other thing that is important, I think, is looking ahead for, say, the next 5 years, medium term, what are the prospects for India's growth of output and employment? And I'm a bit bearish on that.
As I read, all the way into 2027. Let me end with this question then to you. What is clearly illustrated in your book is, the roots that you have, the institutional knowledge that you bring to, having seen many cycles. What makes you so concerned about the next few years? If you had to identify the one or two clear missteps that you think need attention, what would you ask for attention to be brought to?
Well, some of the things that are being done by way of reforms, I think pursuing them strongly would make a difference. And I hope that gets done. But I also recognize that they're not easy to do. These are more process and institutional reforms, whether you're talking about agricultural marketing, whether you're talking about labor laws, whether you talk about privatization of public enterprises or privatization of public sector banks, the range of things that are on the table moving forward as we, according to government statements. But I mean, that's why I describe them as works in progress. And against that, there is the array of stuff which makes me think that this is not going to be an easy thing to rev up this economy. Because, you have, as you point out, as we speak today, a stressed banking system. We don't even quite know how much of the loans are reasonably okay because there's been regulatory forbearance because of COVID, pandemic, and so on. But it's there. Then we know for a fact that our government debt has shot up to 90% of GDP. So servicing that in the future is not going to be easy. And even as we speak today, the budgeted deficit for this year, fiscal, states and center, is around 11% of GDP, which is a record barring last year. And whether we're going to be near there, not near there, it's too early to tell in the year in terms of the information we have. And we don't know what else lurks in the future. So that kind of, 2 years of heavy deficits may have been required, I don't know, but heavy deficits of record nature are bound to leave some kind of macro scars on the system in terms of your need to recoup, whether it'll be felt in inflation or rise in interest rates or whatever. But there are going to be pressure points, and it's hard to predict exactly when and in what, but there will be pressure points. And then, of course, the old problem of reforms of factor markets, land, well, nothing has changed on that after the initial attempts by the NDA government, which didn't go through. Labor, the labor codes are there, but two things. One, even though they've passed parliament, the rules which actually give you the nuts and bolts under those codes have not yet been approved because they have to be done in consultation between the states and the center. Two, on critical things, we don't know what's actually going to be proposed. Just give you one example. In the code relating to wages, we don't know whether the minimum wage specified by the center, we know there'll be variation across states, but whether the minimum wage specified by the center is going to be a reasonable one. Because if it's too high, it's going to make life difficult in Eastern India, where wages are very low, as we know, because they are poor states, whether it's Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Jharkhand or whatever. So if the center specifies a high minimum wage, either there'll be very little additional employment, or there'll be a lot of sort of phony bookkeeping, neither of which is a good idea. So those problems are there. Infrastructure is always a problem. And one area in particular where I think we, in the last 3 or 4 years, our policy has gone backwards, and unfortunately so, is foreign trade policy, where we have, I think, turned protectionist. And I think it's not an entire surprise that until the recent bounce, our exports were very flat. And we still somehow have the view that, we need to have tariffs to make our manufacturing and industrial sector strong. But if you do that, you're going against the weight of evidence of the last 70 years of economic development in developing countries.
That's a somber note indeed. I think from what you've outlined in your last answer, there's enough material for another book when you choose to approach it, sir. There will be so much to document in this post-COVID world that we live in. But thank you again for joining in. Many congratulations on your book. It was wonderful to read the personal side of you, and perhaps a life in films that went unattended, isn't it?
Parents didn't ask me.
Yeah. If only. Wonderful. Thank you so much again for joining in, and congratulations.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.